Alright, in this lesson we'll explore how to delete rows or columns from our data frame. I'll begin by executing our code to re-import our James Bond data frame. And let's begin with the drop method. It's called directly on our data frame. So we'll do bond.drop with parentheses. And if we look at the documentation with Shift-Tab, the very first parameter is called labels, and that can accept either a single value or a list of values, and it's going to remove them from our data frame. And the default way it operates with this axis equals 0 argument is it's going to look for these values that we specify among the row labels, so among the index. So let's say I want to remove a view to a kill, which is our very first film right here. If I enter it right here, it's going to return a brand new data frame where that value has been removed. And if we're dealing with a standard data frame where we have a numeric index instead of a string index, we can just pass in the number directly. In this case, we do have string labels, so we cannot do that. But if we had the generic numeric sequence starting at 0 and proceeding upwards, you could absolutely put in a number like 0 or 5 or 10 in there and so on. And if we want to extract multiple values, all we have to do is place them in a list. So in this example, we'll remove a view to a kill. Let's also take out Die Another Day. We see that below. And From Russia with Love. So now we're passing a list to our first parameter, which is called labels. And that's going to give us a brand new data frame where those index labels are going to be removed. And it's going to remove all of them. So for example, we have this Casino Royale label that occurs twice. If I enter it here, let's say as my individual argument, not Casino Royale, Casino Royale, you'll see that it's going to remove all of them directly from our list. And again, this process is not complete until we modify the data frame, and that's done with the in-place parameter, which is also available here. So if we wanted to modify and overwrite the data frame in Bond, we do have to remember to put in place equals true. I'm actually not going to execute this at this point, just so that we can continue working with our original full data set. So let's take a look at Bond again. Let's say that we want to remove columns in comparison. So the previous example dealt with rows. Let's say we want to remove the box office column. I'm going to once again do drop, and then I'm going to enter my argument, which is going to be box office. But if I were to execute it this way, I would run into an error because box office doesn't exist among my row labels. So what I have to do to affect the column is change this parameter, axis, to be one of two options. 0, as you may recall, represents the rows. So writing axis equals 0 is actually the same thing as writing axis equals either rows or axis equals index. The 1 axis, which represents the second axis in that list of axes, represents our columns axis or our vertical axis. So this is one way that we can accomplish the removal of the box office column. And if we prefer to keep it verbal, we can actually give a string argument of columns to the axis parameter, and that will accomplish the exact same thing. Now if I want to remove multiple columns, all I have to do is change this first argument to a list. So if I want to remove box office, and let's say as well, I want to take out Bond actor salary and actor, I'm just passing them in a different order than they appear in the original data frame. That's also going to remove those columns. They don't have to be in order, but they do have to be in a list and pass to that first parameter, which is labels. Again, this process is not going to work until I do my in place equals true, and that's going to permanently modify the original data frame such that when I take a look at Bond, we can see that all of those 3 columns have been removed. Alright, so that's the drop method. What I'm also going to do here is demonstrate a few other methods, but just so that we have a little bit more of a wider data frame to work with, I'm going to re-execute the code here. So we're back to our original full data set. So the second method that we have available is the pop method. That's P-O-P. And that accepts a argument of a single series or a single column within the data frame. And it removes that series. You don't need to do any kind of in place. It's a permanent operation. But what it also does is it returns that series. So if I were to do something like Bond pop actor, it would remove this actor series or column from our original Bond data frame, but it would also return it. So if I wanted to store it, I can actually store it to a variable like this. And that way, if I execute this line, if I now first take a look at bond, we can see that actor has been removed, but the actor series is now stored in my actor variable, which stores that series because it was returned whenever I did that pop operation. So that's the pop method. It removes a single series and returns it as well, so you can store it in a variable or even do things like assign it to a brand new series in another data frame. Just use that bracket syntax and make it equal to a pop operation from another data frame. That's the way that you can kind of cut and paste it, if you will. And there's one more approach. I'm once again going to re-execute the code above, so we're dealing with our regular bond data set. Let's take a look here. I'm going to collapse this. So bond now has all of its regular columns and rows. There is an actual available Python keyword we have called del, which stands for delete. And if we take a series like, let's say, director, we're extracting that series from our bond data frame. If we pass in the del keyword directly in front and execute that cell, that's going to delete that column from our data frame. So now if I take a look, there's bond with the director column removed. Let's do one more example. del bond, which is our data frame, and now let's remove the year column. Once again, I'm going to execute, and the year column is now removed from the left. So that's 3 different ways that we can remove rows or columns. We can use the drop method for rows and columns, where we can give it an argument for the labels parameter. That can be either a single string for a label or a list of labels. If we're dealing with columns, do remember that we have to pass in an argument for the axis parameter. That can be either axis equals 1 for the columns or axis equals columns as a string for the drop method. We also have the pop method, which removes a single series from the data frame. That operation is permanent, so it does not require an in-place parameter. And since it returns that series, you can assign it to a brand new variable or do something with it. And finally, we have Python's del keyword for delete. Just write that keyword in front of the data frame and the series you'd like to delete, and you can use it to remove those series or columns from the data frames permanently.